some handouts here. Is anybody in here not get a handout that would like a handout? If you could raise your hand nice and tall. All right, good job, you guys. If you are online and would like a handout to follow along, you can get that from bookoflifebuzz.com. Click on the handout in the left column. You'll get a PDF file that is exactly what we have here. It's just simply the verses laid out the way that I'm going to break them up this morning, and a place to write some notes if you are a note taker. Again, you can find those at bookoflifebuzz.com. We are in Acts chapter 27 this morning, just kind of making our way on through. We're almost towards the end there. And in Acts 27, we're at sort of like one of those adventure type things. We'll find a few important principles and stuff in there, but a lot of it is just kind of the history of what happened and Paul's experience as they try to ship him off over to Rome for his trial. So some pretty cool, exciting, fun things happening. I can't help but think, boy, that would make kind of a good segment of a movie or something. It's probably been done. I don't know. But again, we're in Acts chapter 27. We've got two main passages here. I'm going to read through them. We'll break them down into smaller pieces and move on from there. So first section here, Paul is sailing for Rome. Again, remember where we left off is that they decided they were going to go ahead and have him tried over in Rome. King Agrippa had heard what Paul was saying as far as the charges brought against him. And Agrippa, of course, had the background of being a Jew. It looked like he was pretty well convinced that Jesus really was the Jewish Messiah, as Paul was claiming and so on. And remember, they're kind of talking amongst themselves at the end. They're like, boy, you know, he could have been just let go because they don't have anything against him, but now he's got to go to Caesar, which, of course, again, if he was being tried by the Jews, they were going to try to kill him anyway. So that's not necessarily the case, but it kind of shows you where King Agrippa was coming from, is that, you know, he was pretty well convinced of Paul's defense. And so now they're going to ship him off over to Rome, and best way to get there, of course, is going to be across the Mediterranean Sea by ship. That would be a really, 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 really long walk. Granted, you know, Paul's capable, but it'd take a long time. So they're going to ship off over sea. We'll start in the first passage, verses 1 through 12. Chapter 27 says, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. The next day, we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And when we had sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus. And as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete off Solomon, and coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. Since much time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the feast was already over, Paul advised them, even the fast was already over. Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend in the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So whole lot of information, whole lot of little towns and cities and ports and stuff like that, and a whole lot of nautical terms that you're probably not familiar with. I had to look them all up. So we'll go through that a little bit slower and kind of pick out those terms and see what's going on here. And again, it's mostly just kind of a history of where they're shipping to Paul, as well as some really kind of neat, I think, insight into Paul's state of mind during all of this, something to kind of contemplate throughout the week, I think. So we're going to start back in verse 1. It says, and when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So it was decided that Paul was going to go to Rome to stand trial under Caesar, which of course at the time was also under Italy, just like it is today. And so the idea was they're going to sail for Italy, and so they get a ship chartered and ready to go. And in this case, it says there were some other prisoners, and they were all with Paul under an Augustan cohort named Julius. So you have Julius, he's a leader, a military guy, right? And he's got prisoners, and he's taken them to Italy. And apparently this was somewhat common. Anybody that did like Paul did, and requested a trial under Caesar, they got to get there somehow, and they're just like today. If you stand accused of a crime, you're not convicted yet, but depending on the crime, you might be in jail, right? So they're going to keep you as a prisoner, and they're going to ship you off over to the judge to be heard in trial. Same sort of thing with Paul, as well as a few other prisoners that Paul joined, because this would be the latest batch to go over and stand trial, and so that's what they did. Verse 2, it says, and embarking in a ship of Adramyttium, which was about to sail to the ports along the coast of Asia, we put to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica. So again, he's just giving you more details on this ship. There is a ship from Adramyttium, and it was about to sail the ports along the coast of Asia. Different ways of sailing. One of them, the easiest, fastest way, depending on where you're going, would be along the coast. Because you're protected, the waters aren't nearly as rough. Even in bad storms, you're off the coast. Depending on the coast, of course, some of them are rocky and you get reefs and you end up shipwrecked, but a lot of them, that's the easier way to sail. Plus, you've got the land in view the whole time. So, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure the sailors are probably pretty good navigating by stars and all that, but me, I want to see some land because I don't do the navigating by stars kind of stuff. So it's easier and was often the preferred route. Also, when you've got a ship carrying goods from port to port, they typically would just kind of hug the coast and go port to port, sort of like a train would that's delivering supplies and picking supplies up. So that was the route that they were taking. At this point, they would have been heading north. And remember, Paul was in Caesarea at the time. I'll have a map up here shortly, and you can take a look at that. Verse 3, it says, the next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for. And so at this point, there's your map right there, that tiny little arrow. Let me see if I can find a little laser without messing everything up there. Oh, there you go. So that's Caesarea right there at the bottom, and they took that ship up the coast right there to Sidon. And again, of course, they could have walked that, but the boat would have been faster. Depending on the season and so on. They probably got there in half the amount of time. And of course, the idea is they're going to keep taking boats on over until they get to Italy, which of course, by the way, is that big boot right there. So you got Rome right over in this area. So they're basically trying to get from here all the way over here in the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, that is a long, long distance. So ship is going to be the way to go. So we see here that they go on up the coast, then they stop over there in Sidon, and something kind of interesting happens. It says, Julius, the guy in charge of the prisoners, treated Paul kindly and gave him leave to go to his friends and be cared for, which is a pretty big deal. Basically what it means is Paul was a prisoner. He was under the watch of this guy. And this guy trusted him, Julius, trusted him enough that Paul's not going to go running off, or he'd be in all kinds of trouble. Probably would be his head, So he trusted Paul enough that he's thinking, yeah, go hang out with your friends. We're going to be here for a little bit of time. This is when we depart. We need to be back over here by then, kind of a thing. Right? And so he let Paul go and see some people, be cared for, ministered to, and so on. So it kind of gives you an early indication of Paul's relationship with this soldier, for lack of a better term there. You can see that he trusted Paul quite a bit. That'll come into play, of course, towards the end of this chapter here. It says, in putting out to sea from there, we sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. And again, we'll have a map here in another couple of verses. This comes up a lot. It says under the lee. Under the lee is another word for saying riding the ship off the side of a coast. Now, he says, They sailed under the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against us. So Cyprus, remember, is that big island, very large island in that map. So they're under the southern part of that and kind of following along the coast. The reason they're doing that is apparently the winds were coming from the north down. Well, if you put a big, especially a massive island like Cyprus, right, between you and the winds, you cut down some of the winds. That doesn't get rid of it altogether. Obviously, they're still having trouble. But if they were to go around the other way, they'd have much more wind. And remember, their boat's wind-powered, so that's pretty important at the time. So when they're under the lee of an area, it means they're kind of following along that coast. And in this case, we see that they're trying to avoid the wind. They're trying to sail safely. And they were having some trouble, and that's why they took that direction. They could have gone another direction. They could have gone north. They could have gone further south, but instead they're using that to kind of block the wind to make their way through. Let's see, we're on 4. So that brings us to verses 5 and 6. It says, "And when we had sailed across the open sea, along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra in Lycia. There, the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board." And so we've got them going all the way on up there. Excuse me, I was thinking ahead to Crete, where they're going to take a southern route. They were actually off the side there. But so you see the line as it goes up. They come here, they hug the corner there around Cyprus to kind of block out some wind and so on. So all that kind of comes into play as they're navigating the seas. And from what I understand, a lot of it does today as well. It's not a whole lot different than when you're on an airplane and they're saying they're changing altitudes to avoid all the choppy wind and the turbulence and all that. They'd have to do the same thing at sea over in those circumstances. It's not just making passengers uncomfortable, but you lose an entire ship that way. So they're trying to pick the best route to go that is mellow there. So let me switch back over here. It says they sailed across the open sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia. They came to Myrna in Lycia, where the centurion found a ship of Alexandria sailing for Italy and put us on board. So we can see here the first ship wasn't actually going to Rome, but there was a ship right up here in Myra that was going to Rome. And so they make their way on up there. They are a little bit closer, for sure. It's not exactly a direct route. Granted, I don't think they could sail this way at this point in time, as we see by all the storms and the wind and everything. So they make their way on up here, and they're going to switch over to a different ship here in Myra, one that's bound for Italy now, heading to Rome. And so he says, "We sailed slowly for a number of days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, and as the wind did not allow us to go further, we sailed under the lee of Crete, off Solomon. Coasting along it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea." And so they make their way on off. They're on the big ship. I wouldn't call it a boat because boats are smaller. This is a ship, right? Not as big as today's, but certainly very large. You've got, crew quarters and stuff. You got storage hold for goods. And this would have been, as we'll see, very well loaded up with supplies and goods to sell at its destination. And it would most likely pick more up from there and make its route, right? So they sail in the direction over there for a number of days, and things get kind of tough. They end up off Cnidus, and the wind didn't let them go any further. So again, remember, the ships are wind-powered. If the wind is blowing in the wrong direction or it's blowing particularly hard, you don't have much you can do. They can't turn on the diesel motors and make their way about because there's, a couple thousand years too early for that at this point. So they're kind of basically stuck with these storm patterns. And so he says it did not allow us to go further. And so we sailed under the lee of Crete. And so you can see right here, they're up here, and these winds, they probably would have continued going on this way or even through here. But the winds were so bad, they're making no leeway. The winds are kind of beating them up. And again, at this point, they're hitting south or even southeast. And so if they're going that direction and the wind's blowing the opposite direction, they're going to have trouble. And so he says they go to the open sea. So they come off the coast here, and they come on down. And this, of course, is the island of Crete. And they're using that kind of the same way they use Cyprus to barrier themselves from the wind. They're doing the same thing with Crete. And so he says they're coasting along it with difficulty. So better that nobody's dying, the boat isn't being capsized or anything, but it's slow going because that wind is not cooperating. As we'll see here eventually in the coming verses, this is not the time to be making this trip. It's a little too late in the season, and that's why they're having so much trouble here. And that's why people typically avoid making those trips during that time frame. So he says they're coasting along Crete here with difficulty, so it's better than it was, but it's still tough. And he says they came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lasea. And so, of course, they make their, hit the wrong button there. There's Fair Havens right there on Crete, and so that's where they've made and where they're headed. Verse 9 through 10. He says, since much time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, because even the fast was already over, Paul advised them, saying, Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and of the ship, but also of our lives. And so Paul says, hey, pay attention, I'm warning you, this ain't going to go well for all of us. Now, it's kind of interesting is in this chapter we'll see that this switches around. Paul's point of view, his perspective actually changes a little bit. So I think when he's standing up here, he's seeing that, we're running out of days, this has taken longer than it should, and Paul, not necessarily a sailor himself, but would have taken these trips fairly regularly. He would have known well enough to say, look at his calendar and be like, hey, this is getting late in the season, this is going to be dangerous if something doesn't change, and so he kind of raises the alarm there. So he says a lot of time had passed over, and this is Luke, of course, is our author here. He says a lot of time had passed over, and the voyage was now become dangerous because the fast was already over. And he'd be talking about the Day of Atonement, which kind of gives us an idea of when that happened. And if you look up, how things went sailing around that time, after the Day of Atonement became a little too late to be sailing in these seas. You got winter on the way. Day of Atonement, by the way, is, if I remember correctly, it crosses over from September to October, so right around now, right? Around this period. And again, it's a lunar cycle, so that changes year by year. So Day of Atonement would have been kind of an indicator of, hey, it's late in the year, not a good time to be sailing. And so Paul's taken all this kind of into consideration. And so what does he do? He gets their attention. He says, Sirs, I perceive the voyage will be with injury and much loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. So Paul's like, hey, it's getting late, storms are getting bad, they're only going to get worse, we're all going to die here. And he's trying to bring that to their attention. Now, when Paul brings something up like that, I always think it's kind of important. Where is he getting this information? Because we see a lot of Scripture where the Holy Spirit is leading him, where he's being visited by angels, where he's being visited by Jesus, and so on, giving him information. Now, with hindsight, I think as we get to the end of this chapter, I think Paul's just kind of operating off of his own opinion at this point. Not a bad opinion. He's not wrong at all. Right? But I don't think at this point that it's the Holy Spirit telling Paul, hey, you better let these guys know that this isn't going to work out so well. And you'll see why here shortly. But I think perfectly reasonable, especially if Paul has experience with these routes and so on, perfectly reasonable for him to say, hey, logically in my own brain, this is a bad idea. We're all going to die if we keep doing this. You guys need to be aware of that. And so that's what he does. 11 and 12. Says, but the centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. And because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in, the majority decided to put out to sea from there on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete facing both southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And so again, we bring our map up here. They're over here. Those winds are getting pretty bad. And they're cast off from Fair Havens here, and Paul's saying, hey, we're all going to die, and they're taking a vote. Well, we're talking to Paul, we can't stay in Fair Havens, so we're going to try Phoenix over here. Not a whole long way. It's got to be a really long way when you got these nasty storms pouring down on you, and I'm sure it took them way longer than if it was calm seas. But what we see here is, he says, because the harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in. He's talking about Fair Havens right here where they were. he's saying, we can't spend winter here. And I had looked it up. I don't remember the exact reason, but it has to do with weather and patterns and so on. You can't have a boat sitting in the harbor there. It's going to mess up the boat, right? They can't just sit there and spend winter and wait for the season to change when this trip is going to be better. So it says the majority decided to put out to sea from there, which basically means the crew, the people in charge of the boat, kind of put it to a vote and said, hey, most of us, we kind of well agreed, let's try to make it over to Phoenix. We can spend the winter there. That will work. That's much more suitable, and that's what they're going to do. And it says they took a vote there. They put out to sea on the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix. So already with Paul's kind of sounding the alarm, and of course Luke writing this down, he's like, yeah, somehow reach, this is going to be a really hard trip, right? And it's a harbor in Crete. Now saying it's facing both southwest and northwest, which gives us an indicator that all these winds coming in this storm season, the ships inside of the harbor would be relatively untouched. It would be a safe place for them to be. And that's why the crew fairly logically says, let's go there. We can't stay here. Let's see if we can make it over to Phoenix. And so that's what they set out to do. And so that brings us through that passage. Next up, we're going to see as the storm gets worse and things get even more gnarly, because so far, really what we're seeing is the ships being kind of tossed around back and forth. They're being delayed. They're being made to go take this trip later in the season when it's not really a good idea, but nobody's hurt, everything's fine, nothing's damaged yet. And so things start getting a little bit more hairy. We're going to be reading through verses 13 through 38, and then we'll break that down into some smaller pieces and see what's going on there. It says, now when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind, called the northeaster, struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught, and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. After hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus they were driven along. Since they were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo, and on the third day they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. And when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. And since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Now I urge you to take heart that there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So take heart, men, for I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. And when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. And so they took a sounding and found 20 fathoms. A little further on, they took a sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And fearing that they might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. And therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. And they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. So things start to get really, really gnarly, and now they're kind of taking some action against that to make sure that they don't get harmed, they don't die out there. Again, I think a lot of nautical terms and stuff, fathoms and stuff like that, so we'll kind of break some of that down and get a little bit better of an idea of what was actually happening on that ship. We're going to start back in verses 13 through 14. It says, now, when the south wind blew gently, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete, close to the shore. But soon a tempestuous wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And so they're cruising along here in Crete. It says that the south wind blew gently. And so they're thinking, hey, things are getting better, the winds aren't so bad, and they're making progress. And you can see, look at that, they were making progress. They're going around there. But remember, they're heading to Phoenix here so they can park themselves in that harbor for the winter. But yet the arrow on our map kind of goes out in this way, so obviously things didn't quite go right, as we see in the rest of this verse here. So they're thinking things are fine. They pull up the anchors. They're cruising along south of this island, heading over to Phoenix. But they're staying close to shore, again, keep things safe and less wind that way. But soon a tempestuous, very fast, wild, crazy wind called the northeaster struck down from the land. And so they're protected from most of the wind by that island, but then all of a sudden there's wind that starts coming off of Crete, and so they're not really so safe anymore. And now things are getting kind of gnarly again, and it's getting pretty bad. They're being tossed around in the ocean. And we can tell that by the way they kind of take action. It says, when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it, and we were driven along, running under the lee of a small island called Cuda. We managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. And so that arrow is kind of showing they're heading off. Things are getting kind of nasty. They find another smaller island. I don't think we actually have that island on the maps, or rather the people that I use the maps from. So they're kind of making their way through, and they got to start taking some action here. So it says that they couldn't face the wind. They gave way to it, and they were driven along. So some of this really is a matter of what direction can you go. And so we see that arrow go off. It's not necessarily that somebody made the decision, let's head that way. It very well could have been, well, that's where the wind is taking us, and we got no choice at this point. You know, we're going to have to go where the wind is going. So some of that is a little bit back and forth. So when he says they were driven along, he's like, they don't really have a whole lot to say. And so running under the lee of a small island called Cuda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. So at this point, they kind of start taking some actions to secure everything, anywhere from dropping anchors and waiting to, as we'll see, dumping things overboard and all that. Verse 17 says, after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. Then, fearing that they would run aground on the Syrtis, they lowered the gear, and thus were driven along. And so at this point, they start kind of taking some of those actions. What you're going to find here is there's a boat off the ship. They're talking about like a smaller boat, sort of like a lifeboat. They would have used this for things like you've got this big ship, and you got these big heavy anchors. In some cases, you drop this little boat, and you'd have some crew that would go row out and move the anchors or set things, maybe make repairs to the ship, that sort of thing. As well as oftentimes you'd have the ship would kind of park somewhere a little ways out, and then you use the smaller boat to bring the people on up to shore if they're not in a harbor, right? Otherwise, you'd end up beaching this giant ship. Let's see, it says they lowered gear, and thus they were driven along. Since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. So at this point, what starts to happen in these seas, the ships will start taking on water. And a heavy ship is going to manage the waters very, very differently. It's not really kind of going to go with the flow. So rather than following the waves along, the waves are going to come crashing on top. And so what they do is they take all the really heavy cargo, which accounted for most of the weight on the boat, they start just tossing it overboard. right? And so these would have been the goods and everything that was on the way to Rome, but very reasonable. We're all going to die out here, so who cares about the money and all the goods? Toss that over if that saves our life. And so that's what they're doing, is they're making the ship lighter. It will be higher up in the water. It's not going to take on as much water. It's going to be a little bit easier to navigate. And so they just start kind of tossing anything that's not vital on over. And they start with the cargo, which makes sense. It's loss of money. That's all that is. Get rid of it. But then it says they start throwing tackle over. And tackle would have been equipment for the ship. And some of it would have been, pretty heavy. You've got these pulleys and stuff like that, some of that. But basically, at this point, anything that's not bolted down that they don't absolutely have to have, it's going overboard. And so that's what they're doing. So they're tossing anything that's not required. Now, this doesn't mean they don't have any equipment left on the ship, but anything extra. Right, because it would make sense you'd have multiple sails, all kinds of ropes, all kinds of rigging systems and whatnot. And anything that the ship isn't using right now goes overboard. It's just extra dead weight that they don't need. So they get rid of the cargo. That's the easy one. Now they're kind of scraping the bottom. Like, what else can we get rid of, to help us out here? And so they throw the tackle over as well. It says, when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Now, he's talking kind of in generalities. I don't think Paul's sitting there thinking, oh, no, we're going to die. Because an angel just came to him, said, everybody's going to survive. You'll be all right. Boat's going to be lost, but you guys will be fine. Paul's not going back thinking maybe the angel is lying to him or anything. What Luke is describing here is what we call morale. Right? If you were to talk to the average person on this boat, say, how are you doing today? They'd say, not well. I'm pretty sure we're all going to die here. Right? Morale is low. They're not doing so well. I'll find my place here. So there's no small tempest lay on us. They're talking about the storm was big. It wasn't small. It was big. And most people, they lost hope. They're thinking, okay, we're going to die here. This is how we go. And so they're not too thrilled. 21 through 22. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this injury and loss. Yet now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. And so Paul's saying, hey, everybody's got kind of bad morale. We've got something good going on here. And so he starts to tell them what the angel had told him. So he's kind of lightening the mood and everything, giving them something to hope for. He starts off, he says, you should have listened to me and not set sail for Crete and incurred injury and loss. And of course, that's just kind of the logic side of things. Paul is saying, hey, this is a bad time to be doing this. You guys might want to rethink it. Now he's kind of saying, I told you so, right? He says, now I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. Well, that's quite the claim while they're all thinking we're going to die here. So Paul's making a claim. They're going to have to pay attention here. Why would Paul say that? So he goes on. He says, for this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said, do not be afraid, Paul, for you must stand before Caesar. And behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So Paul's saying, I got information you guys don't have. Let me share it with you. Should kind of lighten the spirit here and give you some hope. So he says there was an angel that stood before him. And again, this is the basic term, messenger of God. Right? So this angel is bringing Paul a message, but this is a message from God. So it's not like the angel's opinion where Paul's saying, hey, an angel told me this and angels are pretty smart. No, this is from God. He's a messenger. So that's one thing. Not just God, he says the God to whom I belong and whom I worship, that's great, right? That's what we should be able to say. I belong to God. I worship God. This isn't just some, other intelligent creature giving information. This is coming from God himself, the God who knows me, the God who I belong to. He's watching out for me. He wants what's best for me, and whom I serve. Find my place again. He says, for this very night, he says, do not be afraid. Paul, you must stand before Caesar. And so the angel is telling him, you're going to make it through this because you're going to go before Caesar, which is great because Paul now knows this is God's will, God's plan, and can you stop God and his plan? You can't, right? There are times where he'll let you get away with what you're going to get away with. There will be repercussions, things like that. But if God says Paul is going to stand trial under Caesar, that's what's going to happen. Paul can't do anything about that. Caesar himself can't do anything to change that. That's God's will. And so the angel's telling him that. Don't worry about this. You're going to get through this because this is God's bigger plan for you. So obviously, you're not going to die here today. And he goes on, which is great. He says, and behold, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So that's a little bit extra, right? It should have certainly brought Paul's spirits up. Well, I'm going to make it. Maybe everybody else here drowns, but I'm going to make it because I've got a date with Caesar, right? But the angel is telling him, don't worry, everybody with you on this boat, you're all going to live. Nobody's going to die, which has to be even more uplifting, not only to Paul, but obviously to the people who had the low morale, and Paul's sharing with them, hey, this angel came to me. He's an angel of my God who's truthful all the time. It's his way. That's what's going to be done. And he says, we're all going to live. So we're all going to live. So take heart. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on some island. So Paul is, again, reassuring them. He's saying, if God told me this, if he sent this angel, it's true. There's no two ways around it. And he's not predicting, he's not suggesting. God knows the beginning from the end, and this is what he says. And again, this is sort of short-term prophecy here, but this is what prophecy is all about. And I don't know how many times I've referenced it. It's something that really amazes me about prophecy is prophecy can only come from God. That's it. Right now, granted, we've got stuff like Nostradamus, which is it's interesting to kind of look into some of the Nostradamus prophecies if you've heard of those. But you know what you'll find with that? You'll find almost all over the place. For example, there's supposed to be a Nostradamus prophecy about Adolf Hitler, except for the name that Nostradamus has written down as Hister. It's like, well, that starts with an H, but that's it, right? You'll notice prophecies that God makes are not fulfilled that way. They're exact. I mean, they're right on the money. And so you'll find some like that. Now, what makes prophecy a real, legit prophecy is it's given by God who knows the beginning from the end. Nobody else does. Angels themselves do not. Angels were created just like we were, right? So we can't see the beginning from the end because we are in this universe in this time. Neither can the angels because of the same reason. Now, granted, their realm a little bit different, we don't comprehend all that, but it was still created by God, and God is the one that knows the beginning from the end. So when prophecy is given and when prophecy is fulfilled, one of the main important things to take home is God was right. That came from God because he knew, because he's the only one that could know that. No angels, no demons, nobody else can make prophecy like that. And so Paul is telling them, God said it, it's going to happen, right? Take heart. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I've been told. Now, granted, this isn't Paul's first rodeo, is it? Right? Because he's had angels come to him. He's had Jesus come to him and say, this is what's going to happen. At this point, Paul he certainly wouldn't be wise to question any of it. He knows if God says it, it's true. And so he's kind of sharing that with them, lifting up their spirits. And he says, but we must run aground on some island. And again, that's maybe, part of what the angel told him, you need to run aground on some island or something. Probably more realistically, it's an obvious foregone conclusion, right? God says we're going to live through this, so we're going to have to run aground on an island somewhere because obviously we're not going to live through it staying out here. And so, he kind of makes the next connection. Hey, we're going to run aground somewhere. We're going to get out of this. It says, when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors suspected that they were nearing land. And so they took a sounding, and they found 20 fathoms. A little further, they took on sounding again and found 15 fathoms. And so, again, the important part is it's nighttime. So if they're coming up to an island, if they're coming up to a beach or anything, you cannot see it, right? Unless there's like a lighthouse or something there, and they didn't have a whole lot of that kind of stuff going on. It would have been around harbors and dangerous areas you'd expect people to travel. They're out in the middle of the sea here, kind of at the mercy of the storm. And so if they're coming up on land, they're not going to know it until it's too late. It's pitch black outside, right? And so what they end up doing is they take a sounding, as a nautical term, which I thought was kind of interesting. I didn't get into the etymology of the word itself, but a sounding makes sense now because it's done with sonar, right? It sends out like a sound, and then it measures how long does it take the sound to echo back from the bottom of the ocean or wherever you're sending it. So it kind of makes sense. I don't know if that's where that term comes from, and we're just applying it to an old concept of measuring depth is what they're doing. Where's the bottom of this ocean? And so they take a measurement, and as you can see here in the picture, that basically meant a weighted rope, right? Stop the boat, or maybe anchor it off or whatever, and then you drop a rope down. See how much rope goes down before it's not pulling anymore. That's when you reach the bottom. Makes perfect sense. So they take a sounding that way. And so it says, so they suspected they were nearing land. They take a sounding, and they found 20 fathoms. Again, not a term we're familiar with. From what I read, a fathom is about 6 feet, right? And so 20 fathoms, you're looking at about 120 feet. So as far as like a big boat in the ocean and everything, 120 feet, that's shallow. We've got land coming up. There's land somewhere nearby, and so it lets them know. You got to be careful. You don't want to crash the boat. It says a little further on, so they're still kind of going. They know, hey, we got ocean floor here. It's coming up, so we could be nearby land. They take another measurement. This time they find 15 fathoms, so it's getting even more shallow, right? And it says, fearing that we might run on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. And so remember, they're out there in the middle of the night. They can't see the land, and they say, hey, the ocean floor is getting shallower and shallower. Eventually, we're going to wreck this ship, and we're not even going to see it coming because it's nighttime. And so they decide, let's drop some anchors here, which is what they're doing, and stop the boat because we don't want to crash. And it says they prayed for morning. So they're just wait for the sun to come up, and if there's land nearby, we'll probably be able to spot it, and that way we don't go and crash this ship in all this storm. And so that's how they're managing that. It says they let down 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for day to come. Stern basically means the back part of the ship there, as you can see in our image. And so they just start throwing a bunch of anchors off. And I would expect the anchors, they're supposed to be heavy. It keeps the boat from moving around. But especially with the materials and stuff they have then, they're only going to be so heavy, and so they need multiples. And so they drop a bunch of them off, and that'll be enough to keep the ship from kind of moving and on its own. And they're going to hold there until they can see in the morning. And it says, and as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under pretense of laying out anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. And so again, we see this ship's boat. This is that smaller boat that would have been used for maintenance and so on. And so basically, the sailors who are in charge of operating this big boat, right? They know what to do, and they're the crew. They say, hey, we're gonna use this boat to drop some anchors over there. That's not what they were doing. They're sitting there thinking, there's got to be land here somewhere nearby. We don't want to die here, so we're going to take this little boat on our own, which is going to be more difficult to crash, and we're going to see if we can find land. We're going to get out of here because they think that they're all going to die. And so Paul kind of points that out. He says, hey, this is your crew that's leaving. And so, again, what Paul is saying here, I don't think it's necessarily revelation from God, so to speak, but Paul's kind of using his reason, too. If this ship doesn't have a crew, well, then we would die out here. Now, Paul knows they're not going to die out there because God told him they're not. And so, realistically, Paul knows at this point, hey, go get those sailors. He knows it's going to be done because they need those sailors to get the boat to shore. Obviously, God can do it any way he wants, but that's the most logical way. And so Paul says, unless the men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. And again, I think he's just kind of drawn on his own knowledge that this ship needs a crew. Without the crew, we're done for. And so you might want to go get those guys that are about to escape. And so they go on over there, they get the guys out of the boat, and then they cut the ropes. So this little boat that they were going to use to escape, it's gone now. All right, it's completely cast off. And we're not going to use that anymore. Most likely because they don't want to turn their back and find the crew sneaking out over there again. Right? They want to make it to morning and do this together, and they need a crew to do that. And so they cut away the ropes of the ship's boat, the smaller boat, and they just let it go. And obviously they brought the crew off of that first, it's implied. 33 through 34. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them all to take some food, saying, today is the 14th day that you've continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. And so Paul points out a couple of things. First off, he says, you guys haven't eaten in 14 days. Now, as I read through this, I kept sitting there thinking back to the fast. I was wrong. He's not talking about a fast. The fast was already over. That would happen, I think at this point, probably days, if not weeks prior. So he's not saying, hey, break your fast. He's saying, hey, you guys better eat something. It's been 14 days. 14 days of what? 14 days of grueling, being tossed to and from the sea, up and moving things around and doing tasks so that you don't die. Not just the crew, but the people on board the ship. I mean, at that point, all hands on deck, as they say, right? We don't care if you're crew or not. We've got stuff to do, and if you don't do it, we're all going to die. So it's kind of in everybody's best interest. And so you liken it to a battle and a war. Soldiers are out in the field, and then they end up in a battle. It's not like on TV where it's like, okay, they're going to be sitting there fighting for 4 or 5 hours, and they're going to go back home, have a nice big meal, and sleep in a nice cot. No, those can go on for days, weeks, months, and there's no quiet hours. You're in a trench or something, and the enemy's firing at you. It's not like, hey, it's 10 o'clock, let's go to sleep. They just keep going, right? Obviously. Same sort of thing here. That storm's not letting up, giving them a chance to eat, probably not a chance to sleep either. And so Paul, thinking ahead, knowing, hey, sounds like we've probably just about found land, and there's going to be a very difficult place of landing this ship inland because they're not moving it to a harbor, right? A harbor's got deep waters, it's got docks, it's got crew to help you tie the ship up. They're basically going to beach this thing on a beach somewhere, which is really dangerous, right? And so Paul's sitting here thinking, hey, we need everybody to have their wits about them. And number one thing they can do at this point, they haven't had time to eat. And when he says they haven't eaten for 14 days, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's 14 days they've had no food and water. It means they've got very minimal, a little bit here and there so they don't pass out. They're not necessarily fasting, but they don't have time for a big meal. He's saying, eat a nice big meal. We've got a big day tomorrow. You need your energy. And so that's really kind of what he's getting at there. He says it'll give you strength, for not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. So he's saying, don't worry, you're going to survive. This is going to help out. You need your strength. When he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they were all encouraged and ate some food themselves. And so he did exactly what you would expect Paul normally to do. He thanks God for the bread that they have, and he starts eating it, and he's handing it out. They're looking at Paul thinking, no doubt at this point, I've got to expect, they're thinking, wow, this guy's not rattled at all, Maybe he really did hear from an angel. Maybe he did hear from God. Maybe I shouldn't be so worried. I should relax a little bit, take a short rest here, like Paul's saying, make sure I've got food in my body and then I'm ready to go because we're going to be all right, but we still got to work for it, right? And that's one of the interesting themes I think I see here is Paul was told, you're going to make it to Rome. Everybody with you is going to make it off this boat. Nobody's going to die. Think of a modern believer sitting there saying, I just wish God could reach down and tell me. Like, would you react properly? If God tells you, oh, this is going to happen, are you going to do like Paul, where you're, okay, let's prepare for this, let's get these people ready, don't let those people go or we're going to die here, and working with God? Or are you being lazy? Oh, God said it's going to turn out this way. I'm not going to do anything. Because that's not what Paul was doing, right? That's not his reaction. which is kind of interesting because I think if we're introspective, I'd say that would be my tendency. If God's like, oh, hey, I got this, it'll be all right. Like, okay, I can go play some video games or something. But we're working together, right? And so Paul doesn't give up. He's still, running all the menial daily tasks, even though God's got it, because he knows that God's working through them. It says we were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. And so they all have a nice big meal, make sure they've got energy and everything, and they know, hey, this is do or die time, this is it. We're about to find land, and if we're all going to survive, we're going to be off this boat. And so they do, again, the reasonable thing. There's obviously shipments of flour. Flour is pretty heavy, right? And so they start tossing that off the boat because everybody ate. We don't need the flour on board. We're not interested in trying to bring the flour to shore and sell it, right? And everybody's eaten. We're all full, and we're not going to be here this time tomorrow. And so they toss the flour off. Again, the lighter the ship is, the better off they are, especially when you're about to beach it, right? Because they're going to run it aground on purpose and run this thing as fast as they can up onto a beach so that it gets stuck on the land and doesn't get washed back out and people can get off the ship. That's the plan. Well, that's dangerous, right? And if you do that with a really heavy ship, you're going to sit there and bust stuff up. The ship's going to be damaged. People are going to get hurt. So they want to make it as light as possible. And so that brings us to the last passage. It's a pretty short one here, and then we'll be done. And that'll kind of bring everything to a conclusion for us. It says, now, when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. And so they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that they were all brought safely to land. And so we have our nice little conclusion there. But of course, we've got all kinds of nautical terms and stuff in the middle, so we'll break that down just briefly here and see how this all went down. So back in 39, it says, now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. So they're looking around. They don't necessarily recognize any land. They don't see a port or say, oh, hey, we're over in such and such. At this point with the storms, obviously with the clouds and stuff, they're not really able to see the stars. They probably don't really know a whole lot of where they're at. They've got maybe a general idea. And so they're sitting there thinking, we don't recognize any of that, but they see a bay. And so they end up right on over here off of Malta. And so remember, they turned off of Phoenix there. That was where they really wanted to go, but the winds weren't going to let them. Look at that distance, right? Like all the way over there. That's a long distance to be under the storm when they were literally planning on going from here to here. And so they had to make it. They're at the mercy of the winds and everything. And so they make it on over here off of a little island there. And they don't recognize the land. They're not really sure where they're at, but they notice there's a bay there. There's a place we can land this ship, which is great, right? Because you can see different types of land, and it might be jagged rocks. Well, that doesn't do them any good at all. They don't even have that little boat that they let down, so they can't even send people off on the boat to shore if the storms were to allow it. They need a bay. They need a beach with sand. Otherwise, they're just going to destroy the ship. And so they see this bay. There it is. We knew land was coming. That looks like a great place to land this boat, and so that's what they're going to do. And so they cast off the anchors, and they left them in the sea. At the same time, loosening the ropes that tied the rudders, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. And so they start doing a bunch of different operations. Again, lots of nautical terms. Basically, it says they cast off the anchors. So remember, they were anchored out there until they could find land. And so they cast them off. It means they didn't bring the anchors back up. They just chopped the ropes, leave the anchors, and we're not going to need those, right? They don't need all that weight on the boat as they're about to land it. So they chop the anchors off, which means the boat's free to move again. They're about to get down to business here and try to land the thing. It says, at the same time, they loosened the ropes that tied the rudders. That one I had to look up, obviously. I'm like, what are they doing here? What does it have to do with anything? So you're probably familiar with a rudder. That is the steering part of a boat. So if my hand here is a boat, this hand kind of goes down like that. It's a rudder, and it steers like this. And that's what gives the boat its direction. And that would be where they're up there in the wheel. They turn the wheel, it turns the rudder, and it navigates the boat. Now, what it means by they loosened the ropes that tied the rudders, when a big storm hits like that, and you've really got no directional, capabilities of that boat, because remember, they had to go where the storm was sending them. One of the things they would do is these rudders, they would pull them on up so they're out of the water, and they'd tie them up. Now, why would they do that? They're trying to not fight the storm. They're trying to go with the storm. And so those rudders would be trying to steer it one way while the storm is steering it another. You could do anything from busting up a rudder to rolling the boat over. It's no good. So they reach a point where they're like, we have no navigation. We can't determine where this boat goes. And so they pull those rudders out of the water. And so now they want to steer it towards the shore. So they drop the rudders back in, which is done by loosening those ropes that are holding them up. See, it makes sense now, doesn't it? It says, then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. And best I can understand on that basically means they bring the sails back out so you get to capture the wind, start pushing the ship along. So they're ready to start moving. And off they go. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. That's not good. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. So that's what they wanted to avoid, right? They're not at the beach yet. They see it. That's a good start, but they're still out there. And so they're going in that different direction. And what do they find? They find a reef, right? And so a reef is a bunch of rock-like formations and everything. They stick up out of the water. And so the boat hits that. It's not going anywhere at this point. So they hit shallow water. The boat can't make it on through. It strikes the reef, and so it ran the vessel aground, which basically means they hit something, and that boat's not moving anymore. This is the bow, the front part, stuck and remained immovable. So they hit this reef. That boat's not going anywhere. They can't move it. They can't steer it. They can't go around that reef. They're stuck. And the stern, back part, was being broken up by the surf, and so the boat's stuck. The waves are still crashing, moving this boat around, probably up and down, bouncing it off the reef. It's just going to tear this entire ship to pieces. So they didn't do major damage maybe at first, but as they're being tossed around there on top of this reef, they can't go anywhere. It's just going to start breaking the wood up into pieces. The whole thing is going down. It's going to sink. It's just a matter of time. So looking pretty gnarly for them. This is the soldiers' plan, was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. So the soldiers kind of standing at attention here saying, well, this did not go the way we hoped. They were hoping for a nice, relatively soft landing at the beach. Everybody stay together, right? Now everybody's got to abandon ship and go for a swim. And that centurion, that Roman soldier, he's sitting here thinking, he's charged with these prisoners. And if they escape, we've talked about that before. It's his head. He does not want a prisoner to escape. Remember, that's why when the prison doors popped open for Peter and so on, and what was the guard going to do? He was going to kill himself, because it would have been a faster death than what the Romans would have given him for losing a prisoner. And so he's sitting here thinking, it's better off to kill the prisoners and bring their bodies back and then take the penalty for having done that than to let them escape, because that would have been much worse in Rome's eyes. And so he's getting desperate is what it is. So he doesn't want them swimming away and escaping. It says, but the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out the plan. Remember the guy that trusted Paul enough? It's like, let him go off, be ministered to by his friends, and then he'll come back on the boat early on in the trip. Apparently, he was in good enough with Paul. He's sitting here thinking, if it weren't for Paul being one of the prisoners, maybe he'd let that fly, but no. for Paul's sake, he stopped them. And of course, he's in charge. They got to follow his orders. So they decide, they're not going to go and kill all the prisoners after all. Once again, we're not surprised because God told Paul through an angel that everybody would live, and this isn't part of that plan. So we knew, but this is how it pans out. And he ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. So they're kind of beached there. This ship is just it's going to go down. It's only going to get wrecked up more and more. Everybody's got to get off. Anybody that could swim, they go overboard first. They can be under their own power and everything. They don't need assistance. But anybody who can't swim, obviously they need like floaties, right? And that would be planks, pieces of wood that got torn off the ship, anything that floats that they can kind of grab onto and use it to kind of paddle themselves over to shore. And so they do that. And so everybody emergency evacuates, and then they make it safely to land. And so there's our adventure ended there. Paul's trip to Rome didn't start off necessarily the way people would have thought. He's shipwrecked, one heck of an adventure going on there, and that's where we end up. So along the way, I think probably the most interesting thing to consider is as they're going through this adventure, this step-by-step, Paul makes some statements, right? He tells them, hey, we can't be doing this right now or we're all going to die. Then he tells them about what the angel said. And I think we see a little interesting kind of back and forth. We've got things that God is telling Paul, and we know we can take those to the bank, and then we've got some ideas and some things that Paul logically concludes. Some of them turned out. Some of them, like he's saying, hey, we're all going to die if you guys do this. Well, obviously they didn't. So it wasn't God telling Paul that. It was Paul. Again, it wasn't an unreasonable statement. He's using his brain, right? He's saying, hey, if we do this and this, chances are we're not going to make it. And he wasn't necessarily wrong in that matter. They almost didn't make it, but God made sure they did. And so I want you to consider throughout the week that kind of a dynamic there. What is it that Paul is saying? What's coming from the Holy Spirit? What's not? And then where's the confidence in that? We see that all the confidence is in what God says. Let's pray. Lord, we thank you for this chapter of Acts, that we can see that we can really see things kind of pan out in your will and your plan. And Lord, I just pray that we take some of this home with us, and that we continue to chew on it, that it improve our walk with you, that we see as you assure us of things, as you give us direction, that you're not expecting us to put things on autopilot, but rather to roll up our sleeves and to work with you. And Lord, we thank you for that. That's what our relationship with you is all about, that you love us so much that you would even use us to accomplish things that we could never accomplish on our own. And so we thank you for that. We pray that you continue to point that out to us when the time comes, that we would be responsive and obedient to you in our own actions. And we ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen.